Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anaphylaxis Canada's webinar on the new food allergen labeling regulations. My name is Beatrice Pavolo. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. As you may know, Anaphylaxis Canada has been advocating for clear and accurate labeling for over a decade, so we are very pleased that the new allergen labeling regulations announced by Health Canada last year have now come into effect as of August 4, 2012. Anaphylaxis Canada is very proud of its role in getting these regulations passed, working closely with several national patient and healthcare professional organizations, as well as gaining the support of our members, like you, in making these changes possible. Thank you for doing your part in supporting our efforts. It is through community involvement such as this that we can all create positive change and improve the quality of life for those at risk. Today's webinar is aimed at providing you with the information you need on the new regulations to make more informed choices when shopping for food products, and also to let you know what you can expect to see on a food label on prepackaged products. Just before we begin the webinar, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of Anaphylaxis Canada for those who may not be familiar with our organization. We are a national non-for-profit charitable organization that are dedicated to helping people with severe allergies live safely. We provide leading advocacy work in key areas that help those at risk, such as food labeling or school policies. We also develop and distribute educational resources for the community, such as for schools and daycares and other settings, and also have developed great relationships within the healthcare and government and industry associations in order to help give our perspective on safely managing allergies. We also operate 3 websites, which are available to everyone via the internet, so please take a moment to check out our sites if you'd like some more information. Just before we begin, I just want to bring this slide to your attention. The information in this webcast and related resources are not intended to provide medical or legal advice. Participants should consult with a physician about their concerns and questions which are specific to their own situation. Mention of other organizations and websites are provided for information purposes only, and references are not an endorsement of services or products. So now we're ready to begin. I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator for today, Mrs. Marilyn Allen. Marilyn is a facilitator and consultant for Anaphylaxis Canada. She has also worked as a consultant with Health Canada on food labeling issues. She has been very active in advocating for food allergen labeling changes over the past decade and provides education and training to the community as well as to the food industry. We are very happy to have her with us today to provide you with the highlights of the new regulations and what you need to know to make informed and safe choices. Marilyn, over to you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Our agenda today has been prepared to help you understand the changes that you will see on the labels of prepackaged food. We will cover an overview of the goals and approach that has been taken to close up the gaps and to make the task of selecting safe food for allergic individuals easier. We will then look at the new regulations, their meaning, and how they will appear on labels. And in closing, we will provide you with some tips and resources. Health Canada manages the Food and Drug Act and the regulations that fall under that act. The regulations are the rules or the detail that must be followed. Health Canada sets the policies and standards related to food safety and nutrition. These rules are based on scientific criteria, reports of reaction, and available prevalence data from Canada and from other nations. They also listen to consumers through public consultation when setting those standards. Health Canada also provides risk assessment to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency when products or rules are in question. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is the enforcement group. They make sure that the regulations are followed correctly and can impose penalties for not following the rules. These penalties can be in the form of product recalls or allergy alert notifications, both of which are costly consequences of noncompliance. The CFIA, as Canadian Food Inspection Agency is known, is also responsible for inspecting and monitoring food labeling and manufacturing practices. The first goal of Health Canada, as you can see on this slide, is to lessen the risk of accidentally eating an allergen, gluten, or added sulfite that has not been declared on the food label. The second goal is to give consumers maximum choice of safe and nutritious food for all consumers, including those with food allergies and intolerances. Now let's look at some of the details that they have laid out to make it easier to choose safe food for those who are allergic or intolerant. The listing of the source of common food allergens and gluten, written in simple, plain language in both English and French. The listing of all common allergens and gluten present in component parts and ingredients, and the listing of sulfites in prepackaged food when present in an ingredient at any level, and when present as a component if 10 parts per million or more. This new approach is for all ingredients that are deliberately added to prepackaged food, and it is important to remember that all of the current requirements for declaring allergens will stay the same. The new regulations do not apply to precautionary statements. Example being may contain statements or claims by manufacturers that a product is free from, such as peanut or milk-free products. We will discuss these claims further on in the presentation. We felt that it was important to clarify this for you now, as our surveys have shown that this is the most misunderstood part of the new regulations. Again, I will state that precautionary statements, the may contain statements, and free from claims are voluntary statements that manufacturers choose to use or not to use, and that they are not covered under the new regulations. So, to move on with our agenda, what are the new regulations and what do they look like? There are 6 areas of change that we will be discussing, but before we begin, we have provided you with a brief explanation of some of the terms that are used in the regulations. This is a bit of a glossary of terms that you will be seeing further on. The first is common food allergens or priority allergen list. This is a list of the most common foods that contain the proteins responsible for 90% of allergic reactions and gluten intolerance. A component is a part of an ingredient. My favorite example of components are when milk is in margarine, when margarine is used as an ingredient in a cake mix, or anchovies or soy contained in Worcestershire sauce used as an ingredient in barbecue sauce. All common allergen ingredients and components must be declared on the label. The next term is gluten sources. These are the list of grains that contain the gluten protein that cause reactions. All gluten ingredients and components must be declared on the label. Now let's examine the 6 key changes to the allergen labeling regulations. The first change is the new common allergen list. You will note here on this slide 3 distinct changes. The first is that the tree nuts or nuts will no longer, the term tree nuts and nuts will no longer be used. The second change is fish, shellfish, and crustaceous have been broken down into 3 distinct classifications. The third change is the addition of mustard seed to this list. This was added following comments from the public, prevalence data, both national and global, assessment of available science on mustard allergy, and consideration of the potential for mustard to be hidden in foods that make it very difficult to avoid. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the term tree nuts or nuts will not be used on the labels. They will be listed in their individual common names in the future. Please note our Canadian definition of tree nuts are, as stated on this slide, almond, Brazil nuts, cashew, hazelnuts, macadamia nuts, pecan, pine nuts, pistachio, and walnuts. The new regulation requires all tree nuts to be listed in their individual names. The group names of nuts or tree nuts will not apply on labels. There are now 3 distinct groups of fish, shellfish, and crustaceans. However, these group names will not be used on the food label. The individual common names must be used on the label. As an example of this, the label will read halibut, not fish, or clam, not shellfish, and crab, not crustacean. We recognize that there are many common names for the different varieties of each of these, and we encourage you to check with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for a more complete list of common individual names of fish, shellfish, and crustaceans. We have included a link to the website for CFIA at the end of this presentation. Now let's move on to gluten sources. As you can see on this slide, gluten sources are any gluten protein, modified protein, or part of a protein found in any of these cereals. And the cereals are defined as wheat, and that includes spelt and kamut, oats, barley, rye, and triticale. Although it is recognized that oats do not contain gluten, there is a potential for them to be contaminated with other glutinous grains. Therefore, they are continually kept on this list of potential for gluten exposure. The second change in the new regulations is removing the previous exemption for listing allergens, gluten source, and sulfite components. Again, a component is a derivative of an ingredient or a single unit of food combined with another unit of food to make a food ingredient, and in easier terms, it's considered part of a part. An example of a component again is mustard contained in flavoring or milk contained in margarine. The new component declaration list. When an allergen, gluten source, or sulfite at 10 parts per million or over is contained in one of these exempted foods, the allergen, gluten source, or sulfite must be listed on the food label, thus preventing dangerous allergens being hidden in food mixtures. This slide shows a list of food mixtures that contain allergens that were previously exempted from listing the allergen components. These components must now be declared on the label when they occur. The third change is a new requirement to list the source of allergen protein for hydrolyzed protein, modified starch, or lecithin. Examples on the label will now state hydrolyzed soy or wheat protein, modified wheat starch, and soy or egg lecithin. Although some manufacturers currently list the source of these allergens, it will now be regulated to list the allergens and gluten sources for all manufacturers when these ingredients are used. Simple language. There are many alternate names for some of the common allergens. Consider that there are over 14 different terms used for egg protein, and conservatively over 20 ways to state milk protein. The new rule for using simple language will apply to all allergens. When listing an allergen or component, the source of the allergen protein must be declared in understandable terms. Example of this is as we have shown on the slide. Casein, in brackets beside it, milk, or ova, and brackets beside egg. This is a welcome change that will reduce the risk of misunderstanding the ingredient list. Now let's examine how these declarations will look on the label that you will see now. There are two ways that a prepackaged food product can be labeled to indicate the presence or sources of common or priority allergens and gluten. The next slides will show you the two options that can be used. Please take a look at the samples we have chosen to show you on these slides. The first option is, as shown on this slide, is by listing in the list of ingredients. The uncommon name is followed by a common name in brackets in the ingredient list. Example, as we have shown you, is how the ingredients will be listed in common language. The second example you will see is how components will be listed using common language. Let's take a look at the first example. There you'll see the uncommon name flour. The individual name or common name is wheat. Therefore, it immediately follows flour in closed brackets. Again, ovalbumin, and then closed brackets beside that would be egg. And that's one choice of using that example. And for components, where seasoning or mustard is a component part of seasoning, mustard would be put in brackets immediately behind the word seasoning. And again, this rule applies to listing of both ingredients and components. The second option is to list the allergens and gluten source in a contained statement immediately following the ingredient list. When this option is used, all of the allergens, gluten source, and sulfites contained in the food must be listed in a contained statement. This will be helpful, but it is very important to remember that this is an option that can be used but is not required to be used. This will be determined by the manufacturer or processor, etc., and in some cases will be influenced by the available space on the label. Because contained statements are not mandatory, it is important to remember that if a contained statement is not used, it does not mean that there are no allergens in the food. I emphasize the importance of reading the label every time. The rule to consider is to read both the ingredient list and the contained statement. Now let's look at the two examples on the slide. Again, the contained statement must appear below the ingredient list. The uncommon names are used in the ingredient list for flour, ovalbumin, and it's called out in the contained statement in the common language. In the component ingredients, the difficult to understand word would be seasoning. It is called out in a contained statement indicating that the seasoning may include a component part of mustard. Again, contained statements are options to use but are not required to be used when listing allergens and gluten sources. Remember, when common names or source allergens are added to the existing label, they can be, option 1, listed in the ingredient list in brackets following the uncommon name or category name. Option 2, list of all allergens in a separate contained statement immediately following the ingredient list. Point 4, or change 4, sulfites are food additives that preserve the freshness of food. They are most often used to preserve dried fruit and fresh vegetables, wine, vinegar, and can be used in standardized beer. Sulfites can cause serious allergic reaction, but most often cause asthmatic symptoms. Unlike allergen proteins, small amounts of sulfites can be tolerated by those who are sensitive to it without any consequences. This is called the threshold level, or the amount of sulfite that should not pose a risk to a sensitive individual. The threshold level of sulfite is any amount over 10 parts per million. Whenever sulfite is directly added to a food at any level, it must be declared on a label as an ingredient. When sulfite is indirectly added to a food as a component of another ingredient, it only has to be listed on the label if it exceeds the 10 parts per million amount. This slide gives an example of how sulfite components must be listed either in an ingredient list or in a separate declaration statement immediately following the ingredient list when it is over the 10 parts per million. As you can see, it has been called out here either as a contained statement, but it could have also been in the ingredient list. Alcoholic beverages and vinegar do not require a list of ingredients. However, in the new regulations, if they contained allergens, gluten sources, or added sulfite, they must declare them on either an ingredient list or a contained statement. However, again, this does not apply to standardized beer products. Standardized beer, ale, porter, stout, and malt liquor are exempted from providing a list of ingredients. By regulation, standardized beer products must be made with barley or wheat. Therefore, it is assumed that everyone knows that these products contain gluten. These beers do not have to list these ingredients, even though they may contain gluten and could contain sulfites. If standardized beer manufacturers choose to provide a list of ingredients, it must be an accurate list and identify all food allergens, gluten source, and sulfites. This does not apply to unstandardized beer products, as they are required to provide a list of ingredients. An example of an unstandardized beer would be flavored beers or beers that do not contain wheat or barley. If you have concerns, call the manufacturer and request the ingredient information. Vintage wines must declare allergens, gluten sources, and sulfites, as previously mentioned. This applies to vintage and non-vintage wine with the year date of 2012. Older wines will continue to be sold with original labels as they have been previously bottled and labeled and were in the aging process prior to the changes in the regulations. Remember, read the label every time and inquire if unsure. Other exemptions. There are other exemptions to the regulations that have been in place and will continue to apply. The following prepared foods do not require a label, as you can see on this list. Small individual prepackaged food condiment packages served with meals. These consisted of little packs of mustard, relish, mayo, or ketchup. Food and snacks prepared by a cafeteria or a commercial kitchen to be sold in vending machines or on catering trucks. Wax coatings used on fresh fruit and vegetables are also exempt. Bulk foods packaged on retail premises are exempt from labeling. Poultry products, meat products, barbecued, roasted, or broiled at retail are also exempted from labeling. It is wise to check before using these products. Another area which has not been changed under the new regulations and where prepared foods do not require a food ingredient list is bakeries, deli, and restaurants. As it is assumed that if you purchase foods made on the premise, then you will be able to ask directly about the ingredients from the baker or the cook. However, there are exceptions to this allowance. When food is prepared on site, but is then packaged and labeled, a complete ingredient must be provided. Another exception is if products made in a bakery or food service operation are sold or donated off of the premise where they are made, then a complete ingredient list must be provided, as they are now considered prepackaged food. When these operations provide an ingredient list, it must be complete and follow the same labeling rules as prepackaged food. As mentioned before, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is responsible for enforcement of all of the food regulations set by Health Canada. They are the watchdog for the allergen labeling regulations. The new regulations went into effect as of August 4th, 2012, requiring all prepackaged products to have up-to-date labeling information. This applies to all domestic and imported prepackaged food products sold at retail. Manufacturers and distributors have been given in excess of 18 months to make the changes. If food products are still on the shelves with old labeling, this should be reported to the CFIA directly. We have provided a link for CFIA in this presentation. Unfortunately, there are still gaps. Both free-from claims, example of that is the peanut-free, and precautionary statements, the may contain statement, are not included in these regulations. There are currently no regulations or guidelines being considered for the use of free-from claims. However, if they prove untruthful or misleading, the CFIA will look into it. There are also no regulations currently being considered for the use of precautionary statements. Health Canada has recommended that voluntary guidelines for the proper use of voluntary warning statements should be developed by industry together with other stakeholders. Earlier this year, Health Canada issued an advisory notice recommending to industry that a single statement, may contain, be used when indicating the potential risk. This is an attempt to limit the large number of confusing warning statements. However, this is still a voluntary statement, and not all manufacturers will choose to use it or to limit it to may contain only. It is important that allergic individuals avoid consuming any products that contain a precautionary statement. In the concluding section, we will cover some basic tips and provide you with resource information. Tips for consumers: read the label 3 times, before buying, before putting away, and before serving. And I add, read the contain statement and read the ingredient list. Avoid foods with warning labels, may contain. Avoid unlabeled foods, and call manufacturers if unsure about the labeling facts. Report labeling issues directly to CFIA. The following links have been provided to you to access additional information from both Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Both very useful websites. At Anaphylaxis Canada's website, you can join the Canadian Anaphylaxis Registry to receive up-to-date allergen information, recall and alert notices, plus articles on research and management of allergens. Thank you for joining us to learn more about the new food labeling changes so that you can make informed choices when shopping for prepackaged food products. We look forward to you visiting our website in the future and welcome your comments and appreciate your continued support. Thank you again.